Shabbat Shalom, everyone. So over these next 3 weeks, I've decided that I wanted to do something a little bit different and start to focus on some spiritual middot, some spiritual soul traits. And the truth is that I actually picked these 3 traits that we're going to be looking at about 2 months ago. But given everything that is going on in the world, both in the political world, in the health and well-being world, in the economic world, the traits that we're going to be looking at actually, I hope, will speak very loudly and clearly to us. This week, I'm going to speak about the Middah of trust, of Bhitakhan. Next week, I'm going to speak about patience. And the week after that, I'm going to speak about zrizut, about enthusiasm. And we're going to sort of take this trip over these next 3 weeks as we go. So let's talk today about this first Middah, the Middah of Bhitakhan, the Middah of trust. And the first question that many of our rabbis ask is, to what are we referring when we speak about trust? Are we referring to trust of God? Are we referring to trust of human beings? Are we referring to trust of ourselves? What do we refer to? And many of our teachers actually begin this conversation by saying, no, Bhitakhan as a soul trait, as a middah, refers to trust in God. Alan Marinis in Everyday Holiness says this very, very clearly. He says, this is not about trust in human beings. This is not about trust. This soul trait is about trust in God. And he divides it into 2 different ways that we can experience trust in God. The first, he says, is that God will look out for you. Right? That's the mindset. God will look out for you. That is the trust that we have, that God will look out for us. And the example that he brings, the classic example of this type of Bhitakhan, of trust in God, is that of the story of the manna, which we haven't gotten to quite yet, but in a few weeks we'll get to that story in Exodus. How does that show Bhitakhan? Because each and every day we were only allowed to collect enough manna for that particular day. If we collected any more, the Torah said, it actually would rot. We'd wake up in the morning and there would be worms and it would be rotten. So we would only collect enough manna for that day, and we had to have Bhitakhan, we had to have trust in God that the next day there would be manna again. And the day after that, there would be manna again. So this first idea, this first image that we have of Bhitakhan, of trust, is that God is going to be there to look out for us. The second is brought by the Chazon Ish, and he says that the Middah of Bhitakhan actually is the belief that nothing in this world happens by chance. There is a reason for everything. That is the second aspect of Bhitakhan. There's a reason for everything that happens to us. We may or may not understand it at first, but there's that trust that there is a reason for it. There's a famous story in the Talmud in Masechet Ta'anit about Nahum Ish Gamzu, which takes this a little bit in a different direction. And he was the one who said, Gamzu Latova. Right? No matter what happened, he would say, this too is for the good. There's a reason. There's something good that is going to come out of this moment, whether I see it or not. And that is the second aspect of Bhitakhan, the second aspect of trust in God that our tradition brings to us. But let's be honest. Both of these are challenging for us in the modern world to accept. And many people lose their confidence in their connection with Judaism and their relationship with God because of their inability to connect to God through this middah of trust. It also begs the question, and I could see it in some of you that are here, I'm sure you're at home thinking about it as well. It begs the question about what is the difference between trust and faith? Because if we're talking about God, very often we talk about we need to have faith in God. But trust and faith are different. Ramban, Nachmanides, says it clearly. Faith and trust are two separate concepts, but they're interconnected with one another. He argues that the latter is dependent on the former, while the former is not dependent on the latter, meaning that trust is dependent on faith, but faith is not necessarily dependent on trust. I've always understood these two concepts of faith and of trust in a little bit of a different way. When people ask me, how do we define them? How do we differentiate between faith and between trust? I explained, for me, faith is something that is given. Trust is something that is earned. Let me say that again. Faith is something that is given. Trust is something that is earned. So we have faith whether or not we have any sort of history with this moment or this situation, but there's faith in God whether or not we can see God, feel God, talk to God, all these sorts of things. When we talk about that, trust is something that we build on a pattern of experience. On a pattern of experience. I don't have faith that the sun is going to come up tomorrow. I have trust that the sun is going to come up tomorrow because each and every day of my life, the sun has come up, and therefore I can build on that pattern of experience to say I have trust that this is something that is going to happen. But for as much as our rabbis really focus this idea of Bhitakhan on our relationship with God, I will argue that the need for this Middah between people and with ourselves is just as important. It's a trait that we, as human beings, need to work on with one another. And it's a trait that the lack of it really damages and tears at the very fabric of who we are and of our society. Karen Huff, in a book called The Improvisation Edge, shared a classic example of this. She talks about a woman who works tirelessly and endlessly, having not seen her family and her husband for a week. And somebody said to her, well, maybe you should go home and you should spend some time with your family. And she would say, well, there's no one else who can do this. I can't trust anyone to get it done right. And if it doesn't happen, it would be disastrous for this company and for my job. This inability to let go, this inability to look outside of ourselves is a critical element to Bhitakhan, to this Middah of how we relate to one another. The last piece that I'll bring on understanding trust is trust, like so many things that we have in our lives, is not a binary on or off sort of thing. Trust is actually a spectrum. And like many things in our lives that represent or are represented by a spectrum, we try to live in the middle of that spectrum. Either side, and we start to have problems. Too little trust is fear. Too little trust is fear. And fear and anxiety are actually the enemies of building trust. They sap away at our ability to practice this Middah. But too much trust, goodness gracious, there's a bird that is flying around inside of our tent. There we go. We trust that the bird is going to find its way out. There we go. It did. All right. Too much trust is not good either, because too much trust is recklessness. Too much trust is recklessness. According to Alan Marinis, right? Walking through a dangerous neighborhood, thinking we're not going to get mugged, is not trust in God. He says it is unintelligent, wishful thinking. At a certain point in time, we have to find that middle ground, that sweet spot of not allowing ourselves too much so that we're reckless, but not allowing the fear and the anxiety to sap away at that bhitakhan, at that trust that we so need. It's not a naive belief, but rather it's something that we can build on. It's not a belief that nothing bad is ever going to happen to us, but it's a belief that when bad things happen to us and when challenges happen to us, that there is something that we can learn from and grow from that moment. So how do we cultivate it? How do we cultivate this middah, this attribute, this soul trait? Trust requires acceptance, true, but it also requires effort. We need to be part of the conversation. Trust is not about saying it's all in God's hands. It's all in God's hands and we don't do anything. We have to be part of it because otherwise that's recklessness. And if anxiety and fear, as I've said, are the enemies of Bhitakhan, then our task becomes to become aware of those moments in our lives when they overwhelm us, when we're making those decisions based on those feelings of fear and of anxiety. By addressing them, by putting them in their place, it allows us to let Bhitakhan, to let trust flourish and grow. Greg Marcus, in his book Spiritual Practice and Good Actions, actually provided a number of different ways that we can help cultivate this attribute of Bhitakhan. And I'll bring one more in by Rabbi Mark Margulies that I liked a lot. First, he says, how do we cultivate Bhitakhan? Ask God for help when facing a challenge. This idea of asking for help, in and of itself, that is an action that is based on trust. We don't ask for help from someone, from something that we don't trust. We don't ask for help if we can't trust that the help that we're going to get is actually going to help us. The very act of opening ourselves up and asking for help builds trust, brings that positive energy of connection, and frankly counters fear, which is the enemy of trust. Marcus also says that he likes to use a mantra to help counter worry and anxiety. The one he likes actually comes from a Middle Eastern, I believe it's an Arabic mantra that says, trust in God, but tie your camel. Right? Trust in God, but tie your camel. It's this idea of being involved and engaged in your own life also. It's not enough just to say, I'm trusting in God, but at some point in time, if I don't want my camel to walk away, I'm going to tie my camel. Let's be reasonable about this. Let's be involved in that. And finally, he says, surrender our need to have a particular outcome in our lives. So often, we hurt ourselves by the fact that we are expecting and desire one outcome and only one outcome. But at a certain point in time, we need to understand that there's a variety of possible outcomes, and many of them may actually be good. Many of them may be positive. Some of them may be ones that we will grow and learn from in ways we hadn't even thought about before, because we couldn't see past this moment and our own limitations. When we surrender our need to have a particular outcome and trust that the current that we're in of our life will take us to places that we may need to go and learn from, it is a way to build this middah of Bhitakhan. And that brings us to the last piece that I want to add. Rabbi Mark Margulies in a piece that on Bhitakhan that he titles Trusting the Process, He talks about how important it is to go with the flow in our life. And it's so difficult for us as human beings, and especially as Americans. We want to control everything and every aspect. But there needs to be an ability to see where the current takes us and not fight that current all the time. When the last time we were in Israel, we had a guide that would teach us Hebrew words at the beginning of every day. And one of the most important words that we were taught was the Hebrew word zormim. Zormim means we're going with the flow. And in Israel, boy, do you need that word, right? Zormim. We're going to see where today takes us. It doesn't mean we're passive. It doesn't mean that we don't have a hand in the direction and in the things that we're doing. But we're also opening ourselves up to see where life is going to take us and to see what life is going to teach us. We need to learn how to practice that act of zormim that we learned about in Israel. My friends, so many Musar teachers begin with the middah of Bhitakhan, of trust, because it's difficult, because it takes practice, because it takes time to learn how to incorporate it into our life. So before we move on in our day today, take a moment to breathe, to open ourselves up to the myriad of possibilities that today might bring for us and this week might bring for us. And let's find a path to allow ourselves to follow the current of our lives and enjoy the journey. Shabbat Shalom.